welcome to the launch event today, looking specifically at a new paper that was launched very early this morning, called Addressing Modern Slavery and Labour Exploitation in Solar PV Supply Chains. That lovely catchy title, designed really to help you guys as practitioners, and we'll find out a bit more about you in a moment, to look at some of the huge challenges that we're starting to see in the renewable sector, and in particular, obviously, solar PV. So we're going to dive much more into some of that content in a little bit more detail later on. So before we actually start, let's have a look at who's here on the panel, and who's here available today. So I'm going to introduce the team who've helped author this. We've all worked on this together over the last sort of 12 months. My name, for those of you who don't know me, is Helen. I'm the lead for modern slavery and human rights in action sustainability. And you may be aware of the Supply Chain Sustainability School, one of the products that we support, and we're delivery partners for that. So I've been looking at modern slavery now for the past nearly 10 years. And human rights in particular around supply chains. So that's me. Anna, do you want to do a quick introduction to yourself?
Yep, thanks, Helen. Good morning, everyone. So yeah, I'm Anna, Senior Consultant within Action Sustainability. My modern slavery and sustainable procurement journey started working in-house at a construction manufacturing company, probably, hard question, maybe 8 years ago, 9-10 years ago, I have no idea, it's a bit of a blur really. And since then I've been working as a consultant over the last 5 to 6 years in Australia and in the UK for action sustainability. So yeah, that's sort of my background in this.
Brilliant, thanks Anna. And EJ?
Morning everyone, I'm EJ, I'm a consultant. I've been working in the field of human rights, modern slavery, bit of social value thrown in there as well. I currently lead the Supply Chain Sustainability School's Modern Slavery Group, and I've been working in developing more sustainable supply chains for as long as I've been at Action Sustainability, which is coming up to 20 years. Yeah, that's me.
Brilliant, thanks EJ. So that's the team in terms of the authoring. We'll go into those a little bit more detail. For today's session, we will be recording this. So the recording will be available if you want to forward that round. Obviously, you'll get the link to the guide itself at the end of this as well, and we can send the slides out. Please do use the Q&A function. We'll have questions and answers all the way through the session, and a panel discussion and Q&A section at the end. So please feel free to put questions in and comments, and we'll obviously want to engage as much with you as possible, and really understand what you need to know and what you want to know specifically related to the guide and what's contained within this. So we'll meet the other panel members in a moment, excuse me, but just in case you're not familiar with Action Sustainability, as EJ just said, we've been around now for nearly 20 years. EJ has been with the company since it started. I think I started a couple of years afterwards in terms of sustainable procurement. We are focusing very much on supply chains. That's our passion, that's what we do, and particularly sustainable supply chains. We run the Supply Chain Sustainability School, you may be familiar with, which has a lot of free resources, and the sustainability tool, which is all about capturing metrics. And me and the team, EJ and Anna, really do focus a lot these days on how we help organisations embed requirements to address modern slavery, not just in things like solar panels, but also across loads of sort of contracts, procurement requirements. And you can see on the screen some of the companies that we've worked with. The other thing that we've done at AS is supported the standards that are coming out. So you may be familiar, beginning of this year, sorry, the British standard BS 25700 came out. We were part of the authoring committee for that. That's a free standard. And funnily enough, there's a lot of what we are expecting from the standard in the guide as well. So they're quite nicely aligned. We're trying to bring those together. And last week was the launch of the ISO standard. So the British standard is going to be converted into an international standard. That started last week, and we're leading the UK drafting committee for that. So it's an area that we're all really passionate about and really want to make a difference on. So these are the sorts of things that we're trying to bring to these sorts of guides going forward. But it's not just us. We've had some brilliant funding partners and contributors to the guide through the last few months, last year. So you're going to be hearing later on from Joe, Joe Potts, the Sustainability Director for Supply Chain and Materials for Balfour Beatty. Lovely to see you, Alexia. I've seen you there, Alexia. Roboletto from Trade and Sustainability and Solar Power Europe. And Mandy Messenger, the Managing Director from Advanti, and we'll get them to introduce themselves when we get them into the panel session later on. And Alexia is going to be doing a bit of a presentation on SSI, what's going on within the sector around trying to address some of these challenges. So that's who you've got. In terms of what we're going to go over the next couple of next sort of hour and 45, we're going to give you a quick look in a minute to how we created the guide. Then EJ is going to actually give you a bit more deeper dive into what the issue actually is. Some of you will be familiar with a lot of the detail contained within it. Some of you might be aware that there is an issue, but not really sure some of the detail. So we're going to pull some of the key bits from the guide, and EJ is going to present that. Anna is then very kindly going to give us an overview of the guide itself, what's contained, how to use it. And then we're going to hear from Alexia, who's going to give us an overview into the Solar Stewardship Initiative and the work that Solar Power Europe and Solar Energy UK are doing. And then we're going to hear from our lovely panel, who are going to talk much more than we're doing in terms of why this is important, why they've supported the project, and what they think supply chain should be doing. And then it's your opportunity for Q&A. So you'll have an opportunity to pose questions. So please keep putting those through into the Q&A session, and we'll capture those and I'll facilitate those as we go through. So that's us. But I'd like to know a little bit more about who's on the call. I can see the list. I can see some friends and people that we've known for a long time, but I can see a lot of people that we don't know. So what I'd like to do is just do a couple of questions in terms of who you are. So for those of you who've been on stuff that we've done before, you'll be familiar with Menti. For those of you who haven't, if you can pick out your phone, you can use the QR code, excuse me, and that will take you directly where you need to be. Otherwise, if you go to menti.com and use the code 83574927, so that's 83574927. And what I'd like to do is just get a bit of an insight into what your role is, what your organisation does, and roughly the size of your business as well, so we can get an idea about, you know, the variety of value chain that are interested in the guide going forward. So I'll let the numbers come in a little bit. I love all the multicolour thumbs that keep going up saying you're in there. You're nearly in there. All these numbers keep going up. It's a bit strange. It's great to see so many of you on the call. It's absolutely brilliant. Right. What I will do is, as you come through, hopefully everybody's okay. Any problems, I'll just tell you that number again. It's 83574927 if you haven't used the QR code and want to go direct in. Okay. Please stay in this Menti throughout, because we're going to use it for a couple of questions in EJ's section. She's going to use it. And I have one final question at the end as well, in terms of what's next that I'd like you to use. So keep this open on your phone if you can. We will be diving into it in and out throughout the whole session. Okay, so one of the things that we've done with the guide is we've tried to think about everybody's role within the value chain. So I'd like to understand on our call what your organisation does. So are you central government? Are you local government? We've had those organisations help us. Are you a main contractor? Are you a manufacturer or a supplier? Waste disposal, so thinking about end of life, NGO, academia, design and consultancy services, an energy provider or an installer, just to get an idea of who's on the call. So I'll let everybody. This is where I have to test my maths and add that all up to see if it comes anywhere close to the number in the corner. So just bear with me a moment. Brilliant. Okay, so we have quite a few main contractors, and obviously we see this a lot with the fact that there's lots of requirements put onto main contractors when they're thinking about how they're building schemes, looking at the built environment. So, and we have a lot of friends, if you like, because we are a lot of work in the built environment, so that's fine. Design and consultancy, installers, which is really good. And we have had a lot of input from government into this report, so it's nice to see some of our contributors are on the call as well. Some people, I've got someone in saying they're a subcontractor. That's fine, not a problem in terms of main contractor. Subcontractor, if you've got, that's not a problem, pop that into that section. So a lot of stuff at the top end of the supply chain in terms of thinking about how we get into that transparency piece, which is really good. Okay, next question. Interesting, what's your role in your organization? So this is a cloud. So have we got procurement? Have we got bid writing? Have we got buyer? Have we got sustainability? Have we got anybody with human rights? Have we got anybody okay, head of procurement, commercial? Jesse, yeah, I can see your question in terms of building owner. That's fine. I'll capture that as well. Energy assistant, somebody who's doing something around modern slavery, a lot of responsible sourcing, some HSEQ, health, safety, environment and quality, if I remember that, for those of you who may not be familiar with it. Human rights tech solution, okay, I think I know where that's going. Director, brilliant. Lots of procurement, lots of human rights, lots of sustainability. So we've got basically our target audience in the main on the call, which is great. There's going to be lots of really useful stuff for you to go through. Brilliant. And then the last question from me is the size of your organization. So are we talking micro business here, a small business, a medium business, large business UK based, large business non-UK based, global business with multi-country locations, non-business as in academia, NGOs, organizations that obviously are not classified as a business. Okay, so we're seeing large number of large national businesses, which is good. A couple of businesses not necessarily based in the UK. Quite a number of global businesses with multi-country locations, which is also good. Medium size, and you'll go through when we see this. The guide was written in a way that hopefully it can apply to everybody, from a smallish business up to that sort of global business perspective, and you'll see how we've catered for that through the guide if you dive into it. Okay. So we've got a real cross-section today on this call, which is absolutely brilliant, and a good cross-section of the value chain, good cross-section of sizes of business. So let's get into the meat. Before I hand you over to EJ, who's going to give you the issue, just a bit of background on how we produced this guide. So we came up with the idea probably about a year and a half ago, off the back of a lot of things that we're seeing. And we have had some brilliant supporters, some funding organisations, some of which are on the call today. Some of you might be on the call in the background, who basically helped us pull this together, helped us pull the funds together and helped us scope it out, work with the steering group. So the guidance is published today, and it's based off work that has looked at stakeholder engagement, desktop research, and working groups to actually analyse the content and work out how it can be practically applied. One of the important things we want organisations to understand is that this guide is not written in a way that is either contradicting or ignoring what's already out there. There's some amazing work that's already been done on various different reports, various different academia, even in different countries. We've had some very interesting conversations with the US, some very interesting conversations with organisations in Australia, Denmark. And what we wanted to do was take what's out there and find a way to make it practical. Not saying that it wasn't practical, but make it a way that can resonate with organisations, make it really link to people and their roles. So it's not just the what to do, it's the how to do it piece. So over the last sort of 8-9 months, we've literally, I think Anna and Ej and me have gone through 60, 70 pieces of reports, research, different pieces of data, through big reports, academic reports, through to news, through to industry and market intelligence. We've interviewed so many different organisations in the value chain, all the way from government through to solar organisations, through to trade associations, through auditing organisations, procurement people, finance, SMEs, to really get an idea of actually what is going on in business in terms of how much is being done, where are the gaps, where is the support needed to help us do that. And as I said, we've already been speaking internationally as well, because whether we like it or not, this is not just a UK issue, and we're seeing that more and more now with some of the stories that are coming through. So we've had links out to Australia, Denmark, US, and even China, speaking to some organisations out there. So hopefully that breadth you can see from the sorts of research that we've got. When you go into the guide, you can see at the back some of the people we've interviewed, some of the pieces of research that have influenced the recommendations that have come in. So if you want to know more about those particular aspects, you can dive in at the back, and we've provided all the links and things for you to go and get more information. So all of that's been working. We've been working on stakeholder groups. We've been working with the funding organisations to help steer this direction. And basically what we've got today is what's come from the back of that. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to EJ, who's going to give you a little bit of the intel around some of the stuff we found and why we think this this document is so important. So EJ, can I hand over to you?
Fantastic. Thanks, Helen. Helen, if it's okay with you, I'll just tell you when to jump to slides, but we can stay on this one for now. Thank you. Okay, hi everyone. I'm going to kick off with a quick summary of the current state of solar, and then look at what the issues are which bring us all here today, as well as touch on the business case as to why we need to take action, and I guess why we're all here today, and why we need to address modern slavery and exploitation in our solar PV supply chains. Please do feel free to share any insights in the chat as I go along, because I know there's a lot of experts out there. So I'd love to get your thoughts as we go through. So we go to the next slide, please. Pretty much every day we hear in the news about global temperatures increasing, the effects of climate change. They're apparent in all corners of the world, and the transition to a low carbon economy, it's more urgent than ever before. Solar clearly has a vital role to play here in enabling this transition. It captures solar energy efficiently, it produces low carbon electricity, and it significantly reduces greenhouse gas emissions and that dependence on fossil fuels. So let's have a look at the current state of solar. So I've taken this from the guide. I'm not going to touch on all of these points here, but a few key things. So solar, it's one of the fastest growing renewable technologies. Investment in solar PV is set to exceed that of oil production for the first time ever. And solar is expected to be the main electricity source in Europe by 2050. And when we think about solar, remember to think about the whole broad range of potential uses. So you've got lighting, signalling, windows, ventilation and cooling, EV charging stations, boats, off-grid power, scientific applications, water treatment plants. So many sectors are involved, or in the future will be involved in procuring solar PV. So this shift to renewable energy, it's urgent, it needs to happen, but everyone involved in this transition must address those negative impacts of human rights violations, which unfortunately are linked to the sector. We need to ensure a just transition to a low carbon economy, leaving nobody behind, and that includes workers in the supply chain. So evidence from a range of sources have exposed how the solar industry is particularly vulnerable to forced labour, a form of modern slavery. However, before we delve into the modern slavery and labour exploitation, if you're involved in developing a procurement strategy for solar PV, loads of you are in procurement, that's great. You need to be thinking about the wider sustainability considerations. So I've got a question for you. If we could just go to the Menti again, please, Helen, that would be great. Jump on to the next one, and then there'll be a question. What are the sustainability issues you need to think about when you're procuring solar PV? And try to think about the kind of whole life cycle. What are those issues? Think about, you know, the good old Venn diagram of sustainability, where you've got the social, economic and environmental issues. So what are those things we need to be thinking about? It's just to get us thinking big picture first. Absolutely brilliant. Keep them coming. Waste, lots of waste there, disposal, and think about waste as well. There's a lot of risks of modern slavery in waste management and the recycling sector. What have we got here? Yeah, carbon, embodied carbon, longevity, human rights, product life, disposal. Yes, absolutely. Social value. Yeah, brilliant. Keep them all coming. The impacts of solar and other renewable energy technology supply chains, they're really complex and varied. You know, we need to be thinking about all of these, about biodiversity, land rights, embodied carbon, pollution in the circular economy, right through, as some of you have said, from raw material extraction through to that end-of-life product stewardship. Brilliant. Okay, that's great. Thank you. Feel free to keep on adding, but if we could just jump back to the slides, that would be great. Thanks, Helen. Go to the next one. Yeah, there we go. So this is taken from the guide. It just shows the various considerations at the different stages. So if you are developing a procurement strategy, in order for it to be balanced and effective, you need to ensure that all the people, all the key stakeholders involved in the procurement understand those broader social, economic and environmental impacts across the PV and its life cycle. Okay, great, thank you. Next slide, please. So if you've not seen this before, do have a look. Those of you who work in the modern slavery sector will be very familiar with this. This is the Global Slavery Index 2023. It's a fantastic resource. It's got great trends in there, case studies, latest stats. Some statistics here, 50 million people globally on any one day in 2021 in modern slavery. So to make sure we're all clear on what modern slavery means, it refers to situations of exploitation that a person cannot refuse or leave because of threats, violence, coercion, deception, or abuses of power. So with an estimated 50 million people in slavery, 28 million of those are in forced labour, of which just under 4 million are estimated to be in state-imposed forced labour. So, for example, the Uyghurs, which we'll talk about very shortly, in Xinjiang region of China. Okay, so I think the next question, I think it's a Menti, if we could go to that. Yeah, I'm interested to hear, when did you first hear about this, about the risk of modern slavery and labour exploitation in solar PV? So it's just an open question. Was it something you read? If so, what? Was it a client who asked you about this? Maybe you're at one of our webinars, who knows, but really interested to hear how you first heard about this. Helen reports, yeah, Helen told me, love it. One of these seminars, Sheffield Helen reports, okay, we'll come back to that in a moment. Supply Chain Sustainability School, just through work in general. Anyone hear about this from a client? Could you scroll down for me, please, Helen, so I can see? That's it. The Greenbill Conference, in broad daylight paper, that's the Sheffield Hallam. Somebody saw an article in the news, press reports. Oh, interesting. Somebody had issues on a project 2 to 3 years ago. Interested to hear more about that one. Okay. On a tender. Okay, fantastic. We're so involved in this, you know, we forget that there are lots of people who are not familiar with the challenges that we have. Okay, academic studies. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Could you go back to the slides, please, Helen? So the first time I think many of us became aware of this, and many of you just said that there, was when In Broad Daylight, Uyghur Forced Labour and Global Supply Chains was published back in May 2021, I think it was, by Sheffield Hallam University in the UK. So the report revealed how state-imposed forced labour in the Xinjiang Uyghur region, Uyghur Autonomous Region of the People's Republic of China. So that's the very far west part of China. We'll refer to that today as the Uyghur region to make it simpler. How that state-imposed forced labour is ingrained in solar panel supply chains and deep-rooted in international markets. So polysilicon is the key focus of that report. So 95% of the world's solar panels contain polysilicon. In Broad Daylight talks about how, when it was published, 45% of the world's polysilicon comes from the Uyghur region. Recently, that figure's come down to 35%. So that's what In Broad Daylight looked at. And following on from that, back in, I think it was September in 2022, the UN issued a report into the allegations of abuse in the Uyghur region, declaring that some actions may constitute crimes against humanity. And then fast forward to 2023, and guess what featured on the cover of the Global Slavery Index? Yes, it was solar panels. So I've got another question for you now. If we go back to Menti, please, Helen. What was the predicted value of solar PV imports by G20 countries that are at risk of containing materials, including polysilicon, which have been produced using modern slavery? Oh, I forgot. I think this is a quiz one. I think you've got limited time to respond to this. We'll just wait for more of you to jump in there. The number's shooting up, so I can see we've got 275 of you in total. I can see nearly on 150 players. I don't think I included a leaderboard today. That's a shame. Okay, happy to get cracking on that one, Helen. So what was the predicted value of solar PV imports by G20 countries at risk of containing modern slavery? Is it 243 billion US dollars, sorry, 14.8 billion, 12.1 billion, or 147.9 billion? What do we think? Oh, 1 second left. There we go. Okay, well done for those of you who said 14.8 billion. They're kind of all mind-boggling numbers to me. I can't really get my head around them. But out of, just in case you're interested, the 243 billion one, that was electronics, a big risk sector, and the 147 one there was the garment sector. Okay, so if we could just jump back to the slides, that would be great, Helen. So there's a huge challenge here. There's no quick fix, there's no simple solutions, and there's a lack of knowledge around fragmented global markets on the key components in solar PV and really complex supply chains. What's clear is that traditional procurement and compliance-driven methods will not do the job. They won't suffice. If we're going to address these challenges, collaboration and taking that strategic approach is really essential. Also, just want to emphasise the point that the risk of modern slavery and labour exploitation in solar PV, it is not unique to polysilicon. It's not unique to the manufacturing facilities in the Uyghur region. It's a widespread problem in regions around the world where solar PV raw materials and components are extracted or processed or manufactured, especially thinking about where you've got countries with poor labour standards or where exploitation of workers is common. China currently dominates the solar PV manufacturing and raw materials market. There's lots of stats for you to look at in the guide. But other countries, they're slowly building their manufacturing capabilities. Growth markets are places like India, North America, Japan, Europe. And then you've got countries with emerging manufacturing capabilities like Malaysia, Vietnam, and South Korea. So really just wanted to say that if you're on the call today and you're thinking, I'm okay, there's no risk in my supply chain, we don't source from the Uyghur region, think again. Slavery and labour exploitation can occur in any geographical location. You still need to do your due diligence. And the challenge isn't unique to solar panels. There's a risk of modern slavery and labour exploitation. When you think about the extraction, processing, disposal of minerals and metals like cobalt, lithium, aluminium, steel, guess what? They're essential components in so many renewable technologies, including electric vehicles, wind turbines, and so on. So it's not unique to solar. Okay, so we recognise there's an issue. We're all here today, I guess, because we feel like we need to do something about it. Yes, it's about doing the right thing, but I'm very interested to understand why are you here? The motivations you have to take steps to combat slavery and labour exploitation. Of course, it depends on what type of organisation you are, your stakeholders, the markets in which you operate. So just interested to get your views on what the drivers are. So if we could jump to the Menti, that would be great. Yeah, so I've listed some drivers on there, and I just want you to rank them in order of priority, thinking about your business. Why is this important? So number one is it's the most important driver. I'll just be quiet a minute because I think this one's takes a bit longer to answer. So is it legal compliance? Is it reputational risk? Is it meeting client requirements and competitive advantage? They kind of go hand in hand. Is it investor confidence and ESG, or is it something else? If it's something else, please pop that into the chat as well. I'm always very quick to jump to conclusions on this, and I realise only 10 of you have submitted your responses, so I'll hang on. Okay, so as the results are coming in, I'm just going to have a talk through some of these. So legal compliance. I'm sure you've all seen that governments across the globe are really enacting and strengthening laws to hold businesses accountable, to promote transparency and to safeguard the rights and well-being of workers. There's a map in the guide that looks at what all these types of pieces of legislation are and whether they're disclosure legislation, which focus on transparency, where you need to publicly disclose what actions you've taken to prevent and address slavery and labour exploitation, or whether it's due diligence legislation, which goes beyond transparency and it requires you to be really proactive and conduct assessments, take tangible steps to prevent, mitigate risks of modern slavery and so on. From a legislative landscape, there's a growing increase in sanctions for non-compliance with legislation. So you've got things like financial penalties, seizures, administrative sanctions. In the UK, the Modern Slavery Act allows victims to apply for compensation. And there's been a notable rise in civil litigations involving victims of slavery or exploitation. You may have seen or read about this last year. I think it was Bloomberg reported that there were 3 gigawatts of solar modules that were being held at the US border because of the US Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act. So legal compliance at the moment is coming down at the number 3. So delighted to see that it's the right thing to do. It's coming up at number 1. Secondly, we've got reputational risk. So yeah, there's a huge risk there. We're seeing exposés all the time about companies or organisations that have been linked to slavery, somewhere deep in their supply chain maybe. Companies and investors recognise that association with unethical practices like labour exploitation, it can damage their brand and it can damage the stakeholder trust. I remember after In Broad Daylight was published, there were some solar PV companies that were named for allegedly using Uyghur forced labour, and almost immediately, different names, public and private sector clients across the globe were named and shamed in international media. What have we got there? So investor confidence. Okay, that's an interesting one. Or ESG. So investors are increasingly prioritising ethical considerations and social responsibility. They are demanding greater transparency and assurance from companies to mitigate risks associated with things like this, with slavery and labour exploitation. I saw back in July, and we've mentioned this in the guide, that there was Supply Management, the Chartered Institute of Purchasing and Supply, had an article that showed that more than 2/3 of UK and US CEOs are concerned about supply chain human rights. And there's all sorts of stats out there if you start looking on investor confidence. And then lastly, we've got meeting client requirements as well. So again, what we've seen over the last year, I would say, is that solar PV buyers really have started to intensify their scrutiny of their suppliers. They're asking more questions, they're demanding more information and assurance on due diligence activity. We've seen in the UK some public sector clients actually paused solar PV procurement pending further investigation. But in general, I think clients are generally worried about the reputational risks associated with this. I think that's it. Interested to see what others. I'll have a look in a moment in the chat on that. And I forgot to add in supply chain resilience as well. Sorry, that should have been added in there. So supply chain resilience, that's a key one as well as the global demand for clean energy solutions, it continues to rise. Safeguarding the continuity of solar PV supply chains and minimising disruption, it's really critical. If you conduct your due diligence, you can identify those vulnerabilities, you can try to mitigate supply chain disruptions, and hopefully overall enhance the resilience of your solar PV procurement. So, protecting your operations and reputation. So yes, that is it from me. Sorry, I forgot to add that one in. So I'm going to hand over, I'm not sure if it's to Helen or Anna.
Anna, you're going to go through the guide now. So if you just want to tell me when to go next, and I'll move the slides along.
Next. I thought I'd unmuted, sorry. There we go, next. Yeah. So yeah, where to access the guide. The guide was launched this morning. I think 9 o'clock it went live on our website. There's a QR code here on the screen for those of you to use your phones, get access to it there. The link will also be shared. I don't think we can actually share it in the chat with you all right now, but the link will be shared with you all after this session as well. And if I know a lot of you haven't seen sort of the participant names on the list here, a lot of you follow us on LinkedIn. We've posted that everywhere this morning, so you'll be sick of it by the end of the day. But yes, definitely scan it, go download the report, share it far and wide. It's there free for you to use. So yeah, it's launched there right now on the website. I'll go into a bit of what the purpose of the guide is and some things to be aware of when you're using the guide. So the purpose of this guide, Helen's mentioned it already, is for it to highlight the modern slavery and labour exploitation risks and impacts within solar supply chains. The guide outlines critical steps to address these issues throughout the whole life cycle. It offers insights into effective procurement due diligence and provides lots of practical tips and guidance for implementation. A lot of what you'll see in the guide are resources that are already readily available out there. But what the guide does is it brings them together and frames them in a way to be used practically throughout a procurement process. When we developed this guide, practicality really was at the heart of developing the document. It's something us at Action Sustainability were quite, diligent that that's the way we did it, but also the funding partners kept us on track, making sure that, the way that it's formatted, the way that it's laid out, the way that it's sectioned, and the way that things are sort of called out throughout the document, that it's practical for people to use. The guide focuses very much on solar panels as a product. However, the content within the guide is quite transferable, so it can be used to support responsible sourcing strategies for other renewable energy technology, but also starting to think about other stages of the solar panel life cycle as well. So EJ mentioned that a little bit earlier in the quiz, Menti quiz, some of the areas and some of the sustainability issues, the principles that are presented in this guide are practical and they can be used mainly for modern slavery and forced labour, but they can be started to be used to build that due diligence process for broader sustainability issues and a broader life cycle for solar panels and other renewable energy technology as well. A couple of things to be aware of when using this guide. This is all mapped out as well within the guide, but just want to explain it to you right here in person now. The guide provides best practice procurement advice, so it goes beyond the minimum compliance with the UK Modern Slavery Act. And for those of you familiar with us, you'll have heard us say this before, time and time again, when talking about due diligence, what you cannot do is claim assurance of zero forced labour or modern slavery in supply chains simply because you're following the guidance that we're presenting here. So it's not saying, yep, we're following this. We know we've got no slaves now within our supply chain for solar panels. What the guide does is that if you're following the guidance, you can say you're aligned with procurement best practice for solar panels, and that you're on the journey to try and eliminate modern slavery and forced labour, but there's never any chance you can assure that there's zero forced labour within there. Obviously, it's very complex and it's a multifaceted approach. Modern slavery and exploitation can't just be addressed through a simple tick box compliance-based approach. So what we've presented here in the guide is a strategic approach, which is really essential to sort of make it a bit more broad. There's lots of little bits of things to do, depending on the situation that you're in, who you're buying from, where you're buying from, what your organisation looks like. And this guidance is aligned very much with ISO 2400. So again, those of you who know us will be very much aware of what that standard is. It's a guidance standard on sustainable procurement. So it's aligned with that standard. It's also aligned with BS 25700, as Helen mentioned earlier. It's also aligned with OECD due diligence guidelines for responsible business conduct and the UNGP, so the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights as well. We've aligned that guidance with those principles. Throughout the guide, we signpost to lots of other collaborative initiatives. So you'll hear from Alexia in a moment. So we've got some collaborative initiatives signposted throughout, such as the Solar Stewardship Initiative, the Responsible Minerals Initiative, and the Solar Energy Industries Association as well. So we're not saying, reinvent the wheel. There's already a lot going on in the marketplace for this, and we're signposting you to where those collaborative initiatives are taking place. The guidance is very much designed to support you in your due diligence. It won't give you all the answers, unfortunately. We did have that bit of ambition at the beginning to give all the answers, and through, as Helen mapped out, the documents we reviewed, the people we spoke to, trying to make it as practical as possible. That is just impossible to give you all the answers. but it really is a start into sort of building that due diligence and sustainable procurement framework to try and get this done and start that journey. So if we can just go on to the next slide, Helen, please. That's sort of a few principles to think about when you use the guide, how best to use the guide. So again, linking back to that practicality piece, it's quite a chunky document. So it's 40 odd pages. It was longer at one stage. So we have very much work to streamline it down so it's manageable, digestible. But noting, obviously, everyone's very busy. People have specific requirements that they want to just jump straight into. So we've provided this sort of purpose of the guide at a glance right at the beginning of the document to help people navigate through the document. The guide is developed for organisations of all sizes in any country across public and private sector. So, you know, we went through some of your job roles at the beginning when we got to know you through Menti, job roles, types of companies you're working in. So it's covering a broad range of audience. And whilst we do recommend that you read the entire guide, we would love you all to sit there on an evening with a cup of tea, give it a good long read. But we do appreciate that obviously you all have specific needs and questions that need answering. So this at a glance at the beginning should hopefully help you navigate throughout the document in a practical way. So the guide is broken into different sections. So you've got the guide sections down the left-hand side. So that is sort of what is it you really want to know? It's a question. So if you're thinking about in a meeting or you're at a point in your procurement process, you've got a question to do with the issues in solar, have a look at this guide section and see which question resonates most with you, and head straight to that section. Then you've got a bit of an overview here of the guidance theme. So that's an overview of what's in that section. Within each section, we have a call to action, so a summary of the key actions described in the section. And really, really useful, I find anyway, is that potential stakeholders part. So what it is that your role is and what bits of the guidance is it that you need to be aware of and what parts do you need to focus on. You'll also notice at the bottom of this screen here, there's some navigation icons. So at the bottom of each page where you can move forward and back. And that button in the middle, the sort of home page, will lead you back to this at a glance section, wherever you are in the document. So, you know, you've answered one question, you've read that section of the guidance, and now you want to go back and find another question to answer. You can easily go back using that home icon there. Helen, next slide, please. Thank you. So what's in the guide? The guide is split into 3 different sections. So we've got the first section, part 1, which is on solar PV. So within this section, we're covering what EJ has sort of mentioned this morning. We're looking at the current state of solar. It includes an overview of what the supply chain looks like. So what the manufacturing capacity is, what the locations are, and the sustainability impacts across that solar supply chain. This section then touches on what just transition is, and it delves into the background of modern slavery and labour exploitation in the solar supply chain. So what EJ's already touched on briefly this morning, it digs into that a little bit deeper and also points into lots of different resources where you can read up and gain that knowledge a little bit further. This section then ends with an introduction to some of those industry collaborations out there. For example, SSI, SEIA's traceability protocol, and the Ultra Low Carbon Solar Alliance as well. So it's sort of coming together what's going on in the industry within solar PV. Then we have part 2, which is the procurement guidance, which I'm sure a lot of you this is the part everyone's really involved and excited to get into. So this is where we introduce that concept of due diligence. And what we've done is we've aligned that with a typical solar procurement process. So there's a nice sort of graphic in there that overlaps due diligence process with a typical solar procurement process. This guidance section goes through each of these stages, providing tips and highlighting those call to actions throughout. So the procurement guidance starts with understanding the need, and then it goes into all the detail of the risks of modern slavery and labour exploitation, how to identify and manage those risks, what the risks look like in solar supply chains, and how to use leverage to mitigate that risk. So one of the questions we asked at the beginning was, you know, what's the size of your company, that sort of thing. It maps out in terms of spend, your business relationships, project sizes, the type of company you are, where you are in the supply chain, and how you can use that leverage to mitigate risk. Then in that section, it goes into developing a procurement strategy. So here we map out what to do at the pre-engagement, sourcing, selection and management stages of procurement. And that again depends on the level of leverage that you have with your suppliers. So it's mapped out in a way that, you know, it's not one size fits all. The actions that can be taken at each stage of procurement isn't going to be the same for a large multinational organisation as it is for a smaller company or a designer or a waste disposal subcontractor. So it goes through all the different actions you can take depending on the leverage that you have. Then we get to sourcing requirements and supply selection. So within this section, we have some really practical examples. We provide model questions and some basic, acceptable and good responses to aid that selection process. We have template pre-qualification and tender questions, and it also provides key considerations for developing tender requirements and contract clauses. And it takes a bit of a closer look at some of the standards that can be used in procurement requirements as well, such as SA 8000 and EPEAT. And we've spoke to people who develop those standards as well. So we've taken some tips from those standard developers and incorporated those into the guidance document. Then we have the managing the contract section. So in here we have some top tips and a contract management decision-making flow chart. So what to think about at each stage throughout the contract management process. And then finishing this procurement guidance section, we have the role of verification and transparency. So again, mentioned throughout here when we were looking at some of the sustainability issues with solar supply chains, transparency is a big one here, and we're very aware of that. So here we touch on supply chain mapping, what things to consider when you're doing desk-based research, and example questions to gather that data to do some mapping. We also provide a template table to organise the data that you've collected to help build a profile of your solar PV supply chain. And then we go into the role of auditing and some top tips when you're planning a social audit outside of that Xinjiang Uyghur region. So we're giving some top tips here, we're giving some example questions to gather data and a template. So again, that practicality piece is really at the key of what we're trying to provide to you in the guide. Then the final section of the guide is part 3, enabling activities. So this final section covers key activities which should be done outside that typical procurement process. It goes into the importance of understanding business drivers, something we've just done like a little Menti quiz on there, some myth busting on due diligence, features of a good policy to address modern slavery and labour exploitation, and finally a focus on remediation as part of your policy and strategy, and a snapshot of where to get support for that supply chain, transparency and verification. So outside of the procurement process, what are the additional things as an organisation you need to be doing to help build that approach? Yeah, so that's sort of in a nutshell what's in the guide. I'll end it there and hand over to, I think we've now got Alexia coming up to give us a bit more on the Solar Stewardship Initiative.
Thanks, Anna. Yes, over to yourself, Alexia. If you want to just tell me again when to navigate, please do, and I'll go through the slides.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Helen. And we really appreciate the Solar Power Europe opportunity to contribute to your initiative. You know, the Solar Stewardship Initiative is a standard and it takes time to build. So, of course, I receive questions from our members. What am I supposed to do in the meantime while we work hardly on the Solar Stewardship Initiative? And then I can also point to your report that I think contains very useful insights on what to do until we have a standard for the whole solar sector. So indeed, if you can go to the first slide, I can start introducing and explaining what we're doing with the Solar Stewardship Initiative. So I call it a standard to be short and to use simple language, but technically speaking, the Solar Stewardship Initiative is an assurance program that is solar specific. And we have created this together with Solar Energy UK. So it's a Solar Power Europe and Solar Energy UK initiative that therefore covers both the EU market, but also the UK market. And the unique approach that it has is that we're not focusing only on ESG, or we're not focusing only on traceability, but we're combining the two. So we will have two standards, one on the ESG, which we're currently working on and finalizing. And then from 2024, we will work on the product traceability standard. So currently we have over 30 sponsors that are supporting the initiative, and this represents a major market share across the EU and the UK. And on top of this, we also have more than 60, actually more than 70 now, organizations that support the SSI across the global solar value chain. We're also in touch with other stakeholders, and in particular the international finance community, and we have shared our approach and our concept for the Solar Stewardship Initiative, and we have found some kind of alignment on this. So they are also supporting what we're doing, and we're keeping them posted on the process and getting them involved as we progress. Next slide, please. So the 5 core objectives are, well, the first one, of course, to ensure that the energy transition is just, inclusive, and respects human rights. Emma Jane and Anna have already explained quite well what the risks to human rights violations are in the solar value chain. And of course, the Solar Stewardship Initiative has been created in this context, not only to address the reports of forced labor, specifically in the region of Xinjiang, but also to create a culture of respect for sustainability across the industry, which is also, environmental sustainability is also very dear to the DNA itself of the solar industry. So these are for ESG. The whole ESG is for us extremely important. We're also trying to establish mechanisms to create supply chain transparency on materials and components origins, and of course, as I mentioned, improve ESG performance. Then finally, of course, these are objectives related to our community. So first of all, build the confidence of stakeholders, so regulators, customers, and business partners in the sustainability of the solar value chain, and prepare our members, but also other solar companies on the upcoming laws, both in the EU and the UK, on responsible supply chains. Next slide, please. So just to give you a little bit of an overview of where we are right now, and how we have been progressing in the last year. We have a draft version of a code of conduct that we call the code, and it sets out the ESG principles against which SSI participants will be audited. So it's an audit-based initiative. Actually, this is a bit outdated. I apologize for that, but we have concluded the public consultation on the code, and we're now finalizing the final version. So we're preparing the final version that will be published by the end of the year. We also have a draft assurance protocol that we're also now getting ready for its final launch. And that provides practical guidelines on how to implement the principles in the code. It's a document that is directed mainly to assessment bodies, but of course it contains invaluable guidance for the companies that will become members of the SSI. And we're doing this in a working group that sees participants from Solar Power Europe and Solar Energy UK. And this working group also includes a sponsors committee that basically consists of the companies that are supporting the SSI financially. Next slide, please. Now, regarding the code, I heard Anna mentioning before that you have also based your guidance on what is already there, so not reinventing the wheel, and we have taken exactly the same approach. So we have based the code on internationally recognized standards, and you can see the list of all the standard certifications and international guidelines that we have taking into account and reflected, and in particular the UNGPs and the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct. These are among the top, and of course the ILO conventions. These are the top influencers. Let's put them that way. Next slide, please. So the structure of the code, we have 3 sections. So one is on environment, the other one is social and governance. Of course, here we're talking about the ESG standard. We don't have a draft for the product traceability one yet. As you can see, we have different kinds of requirements for each section. Next slide, please. So we have conducted a pilot that has been concluded a few months ago. And the goal of this pilot was to test our pre-consultation version of the code to understand how it met with reality. I mean, if it was completely unachievable, or if it didn't take into account the peculiarities of the solar sector enough, because of course it comes from international standards that are horizontal and they don't necessarily they're not necessarily tailored to the solar sector. In this pilot, we also gather feedback from the participants and insights on how to structure the upcoming assurance system. It's very important to remember that these pilot results, they don't give rise to any claim or any certification. That the main goal of this exercise was to gather insights to revise the code and the other assurance documents. And this together with the stakeholder consultation, which I will talk in a little while. So next slide, please. Something that is very important and that you might have noticed is that there are more and more initiatives in the field of sustainability and also for the solar sector. So it's extremely important that we avoid audit fatigue and redundancy and confusion in general with all different standards that are being developed currently. That's why we decided to have a recognition and equivalence system embedded in the SSI, so that not only we can promote other standards. For example, for aluminum, obviously we're focusing on the silicon supply chain to start with. Of course, the idea is that we progressively expand the scope of the SSI, but we don't have to do everything ourselves if there's a good standard that is out there already. So that's why it's very important to have this mechanism and rules to recognize other standards. So you can see here a list of standards that we are considering for recognition. Of course, we haven't yet performed this exercise because we first need the final system of the SSI before we can do all that. But this is we're developing these rules to recognize other standards as we speak in these days. So that's what we're working towards. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of the timeline, I've already mentioned that we have a program to work on product traceability next year. I've also mentioned that we have concluded the pilot. It took us 6 months, more or less, to conclude the entire cycle. We have also closed the public consultation in July. So we got very useful feedback from the process as well. And now we're in the process of finalizing all the documents that will constitute the SSI system. We're also working to set up the SSI governance, which will be multi-stakeholder. So with that transitional phase where we will still have the industry leading and then progressively and also with a stakeholder advisory board, and then progressively transitioning to an SSI board that has other non-industry stakeholders in the board. We're also setting up the grievance mechanism, and we're working very hard towards the final launch in November and December, where we will start the rollout. So I think this is leads me to the end of the presentation, and very happy to hear your inputs and your question. Of course, this is, as mentioned before, sustainability issues and in particular forced labor in the solar value chain are very complex issues, and this is of course part of the solution. It's not the only solution, but we're doing our maximum. We're working very hard to provide guidance to our members and to drive the change that we want to see in our industry. So thank you very much, and looking forward to hear your questions and comments. And for more information, you can go to the Solar Stewardship Initiative website, and stay tuned for big announcements in the next few weeks.
Brilliant, thanks, Alexia. It's worth just taking a little stop now before we go into the panel discussion, in terms of speaking to our amazing funders and actually asking Alexia a couple more questions, because there's quite a few questions in here, Alexia. Some you might be able to answer today, some we might need you to take away and have a think about. But I think one of the things to let everybody know is that when I started talking to a lot of the people that I have engaged with on solar panels a couple of years ago, my head hurt when we were trying to work out how to address this stuff, because there was nothing. The Helen report came in and dropped like a bomb on everybody's doorstep and went, oh, we have this issue, we need to do it, and nothing was happening. So the Helen report has been amazing in terms of raising awareness, making sure everybody understands that there is this issue that we need to do. And the Helen reports are fantastic in terms of not just on solar panels. If you've got cotton, if you've got aluminium, car builders, you know, it's literally set a huge knock-on effect on supply chain decision making. Over the 2 years that we've been looking at this, you cannot keep up with the amount of stuff that's going on now. There is so much happening from the industry, like Alexia's been talking about, trying to grapple with how to bring this into business world, how to bring it into normal thinking. A lot of this is also about collaboration, because you as businesses can only do so much. You need to rely a lot on the collaboration, and you have to keep a really big eye on the geopolitical space in terms of how the legislation is going out. And obviously the biggest piece of legislation that really had an impact and helped in a strange way was the US legislation that looked at traceability, and the issue with traceability for the US legislation is very different from any other legislation that's out there at the moment, in as much that in the US, you need to prove that it doesn't come from Xinjiang. It's not due due diligence. It's not tell me you've thought about it. It's you have to prove. So to a certain extent, we have been incredibly lucky that we've been able to pull all of these things that have been happening across the world and put them into a guide for you to show you the direction of travel. But one of the really interesting things that we had when we'd finished talking to the steering group, and we can talk to them in a moment, is, do we stop here? Is this it? The guide is your answer. Now go away and have fun, guys. The reality is that in 6 months' time, there's going to be even more. I mean, I can't keep up with Dr. Laura Murphy's emails that keep coming out on the LinkedIn. They're publishing stuff regularly. So I think we've tried to incorporate as much that's happening as possible, and we will continue to support and promote and make sure that everyone who takes a vested interest in this is kept up to date with how things evolve. And also, excuse me, make sure that you do sort of understand that regardless of what's out there, the methodology that we put into the guide doesn't change. The methodology is good business practice. Everything else that you can utilize, the industry responding, will make application of that a lot easier. So I think the guys so far this morning have done a brilliant job in really trying to show you the complexity of these issues, and that things are better now than they were a few years ago, but they've still got a long way to go. And hopefully this guide gives you a little bit of a direction, and will continue to help and support organisations like SSI, the stuff that Dr. Laura Murphy does, to really keep that in your psyche, because they are all really useful tools for you to do. So big thank yous to everyone so far. What we're now going to do is look at some of your questions and talk to the panel. So I'm going to open up to the wider community. So if I can just ask Jo, can you just give us an introduction to yourself? And then I'll ask Mandy to do the same, and then we'll start putting some questions together. So Jo, I'll start with you.
Thank you very much, Helen, and hello to everybody. I, Jo Potts, work for Balfour Beatty. I've been there for just over 3 months, but have spent over the span of my career a number of years in sort of construction infrastructure, and also some other industries that are higher risk, let's say, from a modern slavery perspective. So sort of conferencing and hotels, the third-party logistics and things like that as well. My role at Balfour Beatty sits across a number of different topics, all of which actually interface on the modern slavery and human rights piece. So the sustainable procurement aspects, social impact. But I think that the critical thing that I'd really like to get across today, if I can just use this moment to say it, is that human rights and modern slavery isn't just a procurement issue. And I think it's really, really critical that it's embedded across an organisation into all of the different parts. So I've seen some colleagues that are on the call from other parts of the business, so I'm thrilled to see them here, because at Balfour Beatty, it's not something that's owned by sustainability or procurement. It's a collective effort across legal and compliance, audit, etc.
I love that, Jo, that you managed to get a bit of internal training going on at the same time. So well done, and totally echo those points. Mandy, do you want to introduce yourself as well? Oh, Mandy, you're on mute.
There's always one. My name is Mandy Messenger. I'm the MD of Advanti. We provide oasis welfare to construction sites across the UK. The latest range that we launched in the end of 2020 was our solar range, hence sort of our interest in this. We took quite a long time to report on the performance of our units in the field. We did not want to be accused of being a car manufacturer coming up with incredible stats, so we left it to May 22 to give us stats. And actually, I always say EJ burst my bubble at the time, because when I was telling her how amazing our projects, how welfare units had performed, she said, "Oh, Mandy, you might want to be aware there's some news coming through really about there's potential concern about modern slavery attached to solar." So pretty horrifying, certainly at that point when I was feeling on top of the world, to be knocked down a little bit. So from our perspective then, when Action Sustainability came to us and said, look, actually we're looking to see if we can produce some guidance, and we're looking for people to be involved in this and to help, part fund this, it was a no-brainer for us, because at the end of the day, yes, we want to provide the low carbon solution, but we don't want it to be at the detriment of people. And certainly we are Advanti are a small company. We're not going to change the world by ourselves. So we kind of decided to join the initiative to learn, to share knowledge, and hopefully get to a point where we can come closer to knowing where we are in terms of our solar origin.
Brilliant, thanks, Mandy. Jo, just building off what Mandy's just talked about there, what was the motivation behind why you wanted the guide, and what did you want the guide to do when obviously we asked you to get involved?
It's a good question, because I've actually represented this across 2 different organisations, as you well know. So I think for us it was about having a consistent methodology for all parts of the value chain. So for clients when they're doing their specifications, for procurement teams, and then all the way through that in terms of the people that are providing or installing those, having that consistent view on what we should be doing so that everybody is aligned. That for me was probably the biggest driver.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the challenges, isn't it, in terms of how we get how we get people to respond. Some people may have picked up the UNGPs and read them. They're a bit sad like me, probably. Some people have never heard of that. So it's trying to make that sort of relatable to everybody in a standardization. I know some of your supply chain will be going, it'd be great if our clients could ask the same question, or at least have a similar way of being able to do that. So hopefully this will go some way. Mandy, you mentioned that obviously you're a smaller organization. How do you see the benefit of this for your company in terms of really being applicable? And you've read it, you've seen it. Do you think it is scalable? Do you feel it has hit that nail on the head?
Because I think, first of all, it's about understanding the issue that we've got. So I think that applies to any organisation. So it doesn't matter what size that organisation is. And I think then being getting the knowledge to understand it, and to have a bit of a roadmap to think, okay, where are we on this journey? Where do we need to go? Where's the assistance that we can get? Where's the knowledge that we can obtain easily and quickly? So I think from that perspective, I think for everyone this will be a journey, and it's a case of picking up through the guide where you are on that journey and what your next step should be. And I think the point that you made earlier was very much around this isn't the end. This is kind of where we are now with the knowledge that we know now. But more people join this journey, hopefully it'll just be a stronger process, and things more likely will change in terms of what else we should or could do.
Yeah. Jo, I know obviously you've gone through various iterations of the draft. What in there do you feel is useful? What would you, if you gave this to somebody and said, read it, what would be the first thing you point them to? Other than the end credits, obviously, but what would be the first thing you point them to?
I think for me, there's two parts. One, and I'm going to address one of the questions actually that's been put into the chat, because I think it's a really pertinent time. We do there's a lot of focus on that identification of modern slavery, and I think the first thing to kind of highlight is that within the guide is actually a piece around the remediation and what you should do, and sort of practical steps you can take, and things around if you find it in your supply chain. So it actually looks across the whole piece rather than just how to manage risk. It goes that step further into what to do if you find it. So I think it's in the latter stages of the guide now.
Mediation policy bit, yeah.
But that's in there. So I think that's the first thing. And I think the second thing is really around that leverage part that Anna was talking about earlier. It's about looking across the value chain and actually understanding what part your business has to play, but also collaboratively across that value chain. You know, is your client likely to be buying more than you are? Is your PV installer potentially going to be providing more than you are? Looking at where those leverage points are, I think that's a really critical part of the guide.
And I think that's actually really important. One of the things about the guide for everyone to sort of take, if you're going to go into this and pick the procurement questions up and think, if I put these procurement questions in, they're going to solve my problem for me, you are going to be slightly disappointed, and we apologize now because it's not written that way to deal with it. We see a lot with a lot of the clients that we work with, a lot of people that we speak to around, please tell me how I can be compliant. How can I be compliant with this piece of legislation? There's a really interesting comment here from one of the attendees. Do you think it's true that if you haven't found modern slavery, you haven't looked hard enough? The reality is that we know that most supply chains have it somewhere in there. And it's not about, due diligence is not about standing up, as Anna said, and saying, ta-da, we have no victims of modern slavery. We haven't yet got where businesses are in terms of being open and honest. And I've noticed somebody else say, nobody's really declared anything in the solar panel supply chain yet. And no, we haven't come across anybody who has been very open and honest about it, because it's a very difficult subject to be open and honest about. And if we're going to pick a hard subject to write a due diligence manual on, solar couldn't be the hardest. It's just one of the hardest to be able to do because of the links with Chinese state. So it is important that we understand that this is that journey, this is that remediation, this is leverage where you can. So I think in the guide we talk about the smaller businesses like yourself, Mandy, saying SSI hasn't got all the answers yet, but might be a good place to start. I think EPEAT was another one that's got some links in, doesn't give you all the answers, but gives you a good place to start if you have zero leverage. If we've got, and I've seen some people on the call who are massive energy producers who are investing a significant amount of money, then actually the leverage piece in there talks much more about utilizing that ability to collaborate, work with government, work with organizations like SSI to really increase that leverage and pressure. It's a really important point from the guide, and I think it's one that we need to think about in terms of how we move the supply chain. So some good ones in there. Thanks, Joe. Mandy, what about yourself? Is there anything that you would put under somebody's nose and say that's the first thing to go and look at?
I think that the thing that I wanted to say more around why people using the guide overall and having that whole awareness is the first thing that we found when we try to trace where, you know, everything was coming from in terms of our solar panels. It was kind of quite a reluctance from our suppliers in the first instance to go down the road, because it was straight away that commercial element. Oh, hang on a minute. If I'm going to declare my panels come from this region, I'm not going to get the business anymore. And it was kind of, so for me, it's more, I'm looking at it more as an overall thing to say, look, we need to start talking about this. Yeah. And this isn't a case of, if you say, actually, because what we were getting back, okay, for instance, it was coming from three areas, and it wasn't quite sure which factory, you know, out of 3 areas, or which factory their now panels were coming from, which made it really difficult. But there was, and it wasn't particularly that people, I think people were just nervous because they couldn't give the answer. So sometimes it was, they literally haven't got the answer to get to that nth degree, but there was also that nervousness around, well, someone's asking, I don't want to give the wrong answer. And I don't want to give the wrong answer to my clients in for the same reason. But at the end of the day, I think where we are, we're all in this together. And it's a case of, until people do understand that what we're trying to do is to try and make the change, and we can't make it overnight, I think that's got to be the first hurdle, even. And I'm hoping that the guide is really going to help with that more than anything.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks, Mandy. Anna, I've got a couple of questions in here around the section that obviously you were looking particularly at, which was this idea of auditing and checking and evaluating. There's a question in here around, you know, what should we do if we find something? Do we immediately stop working with them? And how would I go about particularly trying to find things in places like China and India? Have you got any insights of what the guide has provided to support those particular questions?
Yep, so I'll take the first one on going to China and India. Obviously, we're very much aware that there are certain parts of China, especially, that auditors just cannot get into. But what we're saying is, you know, there are data sets that you can look at. You can do desktop research to understand if the manufacturing is being done in those areas. So it's not necessarily saying audit is the one size fit all, go and audit. It's maybe that understanding piece. Is this actually where it's coming from in the first place? Because if it is, then obviously there's a very high likelihood that there's going to be state imposed forced labour involved within that product. So that's sort of touching on the China piece. In terms of India and other locations where we're starting to see a spike in the solar panel manufacturing and production areas, auditing can be done. We're seeing it obviously in lots of other sectors as well. I've literally just seen this morning in Bangladesh, clean clothes, saying, you know, audits are not the one-stop shop, not the only answer that we can do here. We know there can be falsifications. Auditing is one part of the puzzle. So yeah, we could obviously go and do audits in those countries. And the one thing I will say when doing a social audit is aiming for that collaborative approach when you're going out there to do the audit. So in terms of who you're selecting to do the audit, have they got knowledge, local language? Are they able to speak to workers? Are they able to go in a way there where you can, you know, if there are issues that are found, you can start to have that conversation to remediate, instead of just going in, corrective action plan, give it to the supplier, it's up to them to fix all these problems. That support needs to be put in place before you just sort of wipe your hands and turn around and say no. So it's that, I would say, one, it's that investigation piece, actually understanding where your stuff's coming from in the first place, which doesn't have to involve auditing. And then that other thing is the top tips in the guide about how best to do it, who's the best people to select to do it, and how you can be more collaborative rather than just, here's your non-conformances, close them, or we're not going to work with you anymore.
I mean, best practice around due diligence on modern slavery and exploitation is to avoid compliance auditing anyway. And worker voice needs to be a really strong part of that process. So in the back of the table, in the back of the guide, there is a table that identifies organisations that do that sort of role, go out and do the auditing, comply a lot with the advice that Anna's outlined in terms of those top tips. The hierarchy is you will not be able to do any auditing or verification in Xinjiang. That will not be possible. It's, in fact, I think it's even illegal now in China in terms of going in. So auditing is not part of that box. And if we think about the US, it's literally, if it's there, we have to think about withdrawal or moving to alternatives, mainly because that's the way it's going external to Xinjiang, and we are seeing some of the solar manufacturers moving out of Xinjiang because of the connection with it. That's a much more bigger and complex conversation to have, probably over another time, because that'll take a whole hour or two just to have that conversation. Auditing has been possible, but again, from what we're seeing, auditing is starting to leave China because, again, of the geopolitical position at the moment. So it is a really, really tough time in terms of, if you just want to look at auditing, that's not going to be possible. There has to be a mix of requirements that are going out at this present moment in time. And this sort of leaves me, Alexia, it's a little bit of a tough question, but I'm going to ask it because obviously we've seen from Sheffield Hallam, companies, most of the companies that produce this stuff are in China. We've seen that you've got the Chinese companies part of the SSI in terms of being involved in that. Can you just give us a bit more information around how that's working? Because we do know that some of them are sort of Chinese and US, or Chinese, and there's a division, if you like, in terms of the locations. How are the sort of main supply chain partners engaging with SSI if they are based in China?
Well, I mean, first of all, we believe in collaboration. So we have a problem, and we don't think that the right approach to do is I'm coming to your house to audit you and ban you and put you in a blacklist. We don't think that's the right approach. It's not a constructive approach, and it's not going to drive change, the change that we want to see. So I think we need to be very realistic on that. So that is why the SSI collaborative approach so far has been validated. The companies that you see on the website, I think most of them, if not all of them, have participated in the pilot that we have run. So they were the main players in the process. And of course, from what we have seen, there's a lot of work to do, in the sense that communication is very important, and there's a lot of I mean, in terms of knowledge sharing, there's a lot that we need to do, both on the buying side, so procurement, that's your, the guide that you have produced, but also from the manufacturing side, because it's not always clear what the expectations are. And of course, on the manufacturers, they want to meet their clients' expectations. So I think that I can confidently say, now it's not our policy to talk about individual members' positions, but I think the overall trend is that, and that gives us hope that the system we're building, because we're building a system, we're not building a label that you can just put on a solar panel and that's or a questionnaire that you can just tick and complete and that's it. No, it's a process. So, and I think sometimes people don't really think about this. They want an immediate result. They want a blacklist or a white list, but that's just not possible. And that's not what we have promised to do with the SSI. We're driving the change. We're creating the conditions and the process and the plan for that change to happen. And we're creating the market conditions, because market incentives can be very powerful, and we shouldn't disregard this element.
Yeah. And I think the market bit is a really important piece. And again, what we're trying to get the guide to do the reality is, and I don't know if you've seen the news today, there's been it was today or yesterday, a massive investment in Australia in terms of how they're building capacity in Australia for solar initiatives. There's a nervousness in Europe at the moment in terms of the European solar production market is wobbling a little bit, but there is a very strong commitment from Europe through things like the critical minerals legislation, through commitment and investment in solar production, where there is a requirement to look at building that within Europe. And we also know, and if you want to be slightly cynical, the Forced Labour Act, Prevention Act that came out from the US literally came out the same day as a massive $1 trillion investment that was going to go into solar panel production in the US. So we know that countries are building capacity. What we don't yet know, and there's a very interesting comment around price, is we need to get buyers to focus on the right requirements in procurement that will push them to the markets that are clean. I say clean as we can get them, as clean as we can. So it's a chicken and an egg. If we don't start asking the questions through our procurement on a regular basis, we are not indicating to markets that we take this issue seriously. If we sit there and basically say, it's China, they've got dominance, and the rest of the market is trying to create something globally, then that's our biggest failure as buyers, as individuals. So I think it's important that when we start to think about this, right now, we cannot, unless you all individuals say solar panels is not the solution because we can't get them from anywhere else from China. Our hearing from a lot of the interviews is that's not going to happen because net zero will trump everything. What we therefore need to do is start to say, how do we signal to the rest of the market that we want ethical and responsibly sourced product that deals with human rights seriously? And that's what the guide is trying to get you to think about over and above.
Yeah, if I can add to this just quickly, yes, indeed, we're building the SSI to become an international standard. So it's not specifically tailored to China, absolutely not. So because forced labor and other sustainability problems, they're all over the world. So and there is a process of diversification that is happening now, not with the SSI, but it is part of my job at Solar Power Europe also to work on supply chain diversification. And to a certain extent also to European manufacturing, because that's one of our the cornerstone of our strategy. So of course it's our job to keep asking for political support that we still unfortunately don't see for European manufacturers. But also because we want a resilient supply chain, and having a supply chain that is extremely concentrated in one single country exposes us to a lot of risks. I mean, and I'm not talking just about sustainability, but just disruption. I mean, they can close the Suez Canal, and then you have a slowed down deployment just because of that. So, or you can have a fire, and that impacts the whole supply. So, of course, diversification makes sense for many reasons. At the same time, when you do that, the diversification in other countries, you need to be very careful, because the demand from the European and including the UK market is very clear, and that is sustainability is at the core. So that's why we need the SSI to be there and be the standard. And whenever we diversify, also when companies diversify their procurement, when the conditions are there, they have a blueprint to follow.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point. For those of you who don't know, China are basically rationing how many critical minerals they're releasing from their country and exporting to other regions. We know Chile are doing the same thing with lithium. We know that we're going to have the same issue with things like semiconductors, especially with the Taiwan trade at the moment. So a lot of this stuff is also linked to that supply chain resilience. As we start to think about our just transition strategies, we need to think really human rights risk is as important, but it's also alongside resilience risks, carbon risks, disposal risks, all those sorts of areas. It's sort of logical if we want to think about that. Joe, I've got a question from you for you from guys here. It's corporate culture. How do we address corporate culture? In other words, we don't like to ask because we're really frightened about what we're going to find, or we're going to be frightened about the answers that we get back, because we are talking about sourcing from some countries where life is just valued differently. Culturally, it's very different. What sort of advice would you give to anybody that's considering or thinking about that?
Wow, that's a question, isn't it?
It's a doozy.
I think, I mean, it is difficult. We always will look at things through our experiences and what we're used to in the countries where we were born, raised, work, etc. And it is difficult to sometimes shift that mindset into what's acceptable in other countries. Helen, I don't know how to answer this.
How are you dealing with Balfours in terms of, are you having conversations with people who are thinking like that at the moment?
So I think our culture at Balfour Beatty is actually about empowering people to be able to have those conversations. And I think it's perhaps about making sure you've got the right people around you to provide the support, the guidance to enable you to have those conversations. And I think that's perhaps what it is. It's about having that network of people, whether they're within your organisation or outside of it. I'm going to do a shout out for the Supply Chain Sustainability School at this point, because there's a load of resources on there that can help in terms of taking leadership and things like that, and being able to have some of those conversations, but also more specifically around risks in supply chains and things like that. So I might be skirting around the question slightly, but I think it's about having the confidence and the network and the support to be able to have the conversation.
Yeah, no, that makes sense in terms of understanding the subject matter, which is obviously what the guide will try and do. Each, do you want to add to that?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it was just really say it's a simplistic level. It's that whole piece around being able to clearly articulate the business drivers that we just talked about, because we've all had it where we're trying to talk to people, we're trying to convince them about things, help them understand about these risks and impacts. But as soon as you start giving them examples of, I don't know, peers who've had issues with reputational risk, clients who are asking about that, the global legislation that's changing, people start to kind of listen a bit more. Unfortunately, not everybody is like most of you on the call today. We want to do this because it's the right thing. So for me, it's about being able to clearly articulate those business benefits, and communicating that to those key influences within the organisation.
I think one of the things, particularly if you're talking to your Lords and Masters, we might have some Lords and Masters on the call, but one of the things that we like to do a little bit is scare organisations into this thing around litigation and responsibility, mainly because that's language some organisations understand. The reality is that what we're seeing, and a lot of the due diligence legislation that is out there at this present moment in time, is what we call strategic litigation. So it's somebody somewhere is having a problem in the supply chain, and they're using a lot of the legislation that happens to be out there to test how far international courts are willing to go to make businesses fundamentally accountable. And in some other products, I wouldn't say solar, in other products, we've seen it in tea, we've seen it in cocoa, we've seen it in the garment industry. We're seeing how far up the supply chain courts are willing to hold businesses accountable. Now, the reality at the moment is that fundamentally the biggest risk to most organisations in the UK is going to be reputational and legislative compliance perspective. Probably won't be compensation focused in terms of legislation. That will change over time as we start to get this legislation move further and further, and there's a bigger understanding of how it impacts. But from our perspective, we can almost use that as a way to sort of assure and reassure the senior management that it's right to do because of all the drivers that EJ's just talked about, the legislation, the reputational issue. But the reality is, particularly in solar panels, particularly because it's related to Xinjiang, this is bigger than business. This is state and government issue that we need to consider. So what you're going to find is that this is more about big civil cases being brought against the government. And we've seen that with Xinjiang with cotton. There was a civil case brought against the UK government for the use of cotton from Xinjiang, which raised the profile, built the reputation, scared the hell out of everybody, but didn't really stick, didn't really sort of provide any sort of remediation as such. But we're seeing more of these things happening. So the due diligence piece has to be done to protect to a certain extent, but also to get yourself ready for as these pieces of legislation and compensation come in, we start to be a bit more assured that we're doing what we can. Because when you're standing in a court of law, if you stand there and say 2 and supply chain, not our problem, that doesn't go quite so well as this is what we've done, this is what we tried, just outside our leverage scope, this is how we've done it. Courts are much more comfortable around that. Each, there's a couple of questions here on the stuff that's come from Sheffield Hallam and how to use it, particularly obviously the one that Hallam have done recently around specific manufacturers and stuff. How did we incorporate the Hallam material, and how do you think we're intending on, or how can you tell everybody what we're intending on doing in terms of carrying on using that materials? How does it work and complement?
So we've been, like you said, Dr. Laura Murphy has been involved in interviews as well throughout this process, and has helped feed into the guidance. But yes, there is a whole series of news that Laura publishes. I think I'm not sure is it every couple of weeks or every month, but we make sure we share all of that through our own networks. What we're hoping to do is run a series of webinars that we will follow up with. It's probably likely to be after Christmas, because timeframes diaries are quite hectic. But there'll be webinars that we look at these issues in more detail. So we will make sure everybody who's on the call today is updated and invited along to those webinars. Again, they'll just be free webinars that act as a natural follow-on from today.
Brilliant. And I think, interestingly, we did speak to one European country who was talking about producing that list of do and do not use. I understand that from a procurement. I'm a procurement person, have been for 30 years. I understand that need to have a box to tick. But I think Alexia's proved it or talked about it, and I think Joe's has as well. The reality is that the name on the door is the name in front of a very big, complex organization. And I think one of the things that we found through some of the interviews is this idea of supply chain starting to split, and companies that have a Chinese name that have been operating in China, setting up operations outside China to actually then create solar panels that are perceived to be, and I say perceived to be, cleaner than what's going on in China. So this is why we keep going down this route of here's the due diligence. And we know through the EU, through the American legislation, and we put all of the information in there that needs to come in to allow you to get solar panels into the US. There is information that you can get when you ask from a supplier what they do. You can get that from them because they're ready for this for the US legislation. So do start to pick that up and ask the questions. They're ready for it. They're scared and they're fed up of being asked, but at the same time, the information is there. So you are not starting from a rock bottom position where you have those checklists of these are the people to use, they're not the people to use. My advice, along with a lot of the questions I've got in here around standards, is don't just pick a list without your due diligence of what that list is telling you. Because again, what you're finding is in a court of law, and I can talk about this personally because this has happened to me in my old construction days, does not agree that somebody else takes your responsibility for due diligence. So anything that is going on in industry is providing you information for you to make a due diligence decision. That's what due diligence is, she says, trying to say that word really easily. Okay, so Alexia, a question for you. Within the built environment particularly, there is a whole range of schemes like BES 6001, there is sort of BREEAM, there's CARES, there's lots of other sort of standards. How much have you done on the SSI to look at how your assurance can feed into those schemes at the moment?
So indeed, maybe I can expand a little bit more on the equivalence and recognition mechanism, because I realized there was just one slide. But essentially the idea is that the SSI can go through these standards and benchmark them against the SSI standard and the assurance system. So there will be both an evaluation in terms of requirements, but also how the assessment is made. Because of course the SSI is based on third-party audits. So that's the assurance, the level of assurance that we're looking for. So a self-assessment questionnaire, for example, wouldn't cut it, or a client customer that sends you their auditors, that also wouldn't cut it. So in that case, I mean, if there are requirements that are similar, for example, but the assurance process is not the same, then you will still have to, I mean, the site that would seek certification under the SSI would have to undergo the SSI assurance system. But of course, the auditor would take into account that that site has a certain standard already, and that those are the requirements, so that can speed up the auditing process. And the same for the SSI. So the SSI will also seek recognition from other standards, and I assume they will do the same. I mean, these standards, they usually have their own rules on how to evaluate equivalence and recognition, but that's the working idea that we're operating with. You will know more at the end of the year when we have the final system, because of this is of course kind of a behind the scenes of what we're doing in these months. So yeah, stay tuned for more.
And I think there's a few people in here that talked about various industry standards. I mean, if your contact details are on the end there, if they, is it you, or could you forward them to people who say, these are things that we need it to do, and how do we get involved? Would that be sort of a call to action for you?
With the SSI, you mean?
Yes, yeah. So things like the BREEAM, all of those elements that, you know, if people wanted to sort of get a bit more information, is it worth them contacting you?
Yeah, absolutely. I have to apologize beforehand, because I'm receiving a lot of requests. So whenever you use the contact form on the Solar Stewardship Initiative website, you get into my inbox. And I have been struggling these days because we received a lot of interest, and that's great. At the same time, I also have to really focus on finalizing the system. So apologies if my replies are slow, but that doesn't mean that I'm ignoring. I'm very happy to receive your expression of interest.
No problem. Thanks, Alexia. Joe, there was a question around Chancery Lane. Do you want to go through what that question was and your response?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a question that's been raised around an equivalent to the Chancery Lane project, which the Chancery Lane project, just for anyone that doesn't know, sets out a number of contract clauses that can be incorporated around net zero. And the question is about whether one exists from a modern slavery and human rights perspective. The short answer is yes. There's something called the Responsible Contracting Project, and I can drop a link somewhere, wherever it's available to drop. But I think I just wanted to issue an element of caution around it, purely because it's one thing, we can absolutely put loads of clauses into contracts to attempt to pass down the liability around modern slavery and things like that through the supply chain. But what you ultimately end up doing is just passing it all the way down to the bottom, which is generally a fairly small organization with limited knowledge, etc. What I would also say on that is, typically, if something were to happen in that supply chain, reputationally, they'll go to the people with the biggest pockets, usually the person sat at the top of that tree. So absolutely, contracting forms a part of it, and I know that it's referenced within the guidance already, but please don't assume that it's just going to fix everything. I think it needs to be taken as part of a solution and not the entire solution.
And I think the question, so in there we have put examples from that sort of human rights contracting. We've selected deliberately ones that are processed on due diligence, submission of information, and we've avoided the standard one that tends to be, if you find any modern slavery, we're sacking you, basically, or you must produce a modern slavery statement. That does not go far enough. And these are all about that due diligence and disclosure piece. I think there's a couple of comments in here from a few people in terms of where that role sits. And the guide very much talks about the ultimate responsibility being at the top of the chain. So not risk dumping, not basically going, you need to. Collaborative is the only way you're going to be able to get this information. So you might not be able to get it. You might have to go to your installer, or you might have to go to the wholesaler. But you need to work collaboratively to work out how the manufacturers can give you the information you want. And I think we've got some examples in there. For example, EPD certificates show you country of origin when you're putting the carbon figures associated with the carbon production of a solar panel. They show you the regions. So you don't just have to focus on human rights. You can pick up, say, for example, a carbon footprint certificate and see the regions nominated and told in there. So it's a collective due diligence, but you at the top need to put your size 9s in to make sure it happens. And you will probably be much more educated on the issue if you're that sort of top of the chain. There's an interesting couple of questions here on, will we just pass stuff to a main contractor, or we pass something on to a cost consultant? We don't have control. You do. You have total control if you build your contract properly. If you pass the risk on and then just expect compliance, you won't have control. So it's a question on how much you want that control and how important that requirement is for you. So we don't apologize for the fact that, you know, we do try and do procurement best practice in this, not necessarily constant current procurement practice, because sometimes current procurement practice is not necessarily best practice. So we do try and look at areas where we can improve it a little bit. Excuse me. We've got a few more questions. I'm conscious that we're getting quite close to the end as well. I've got so many questions here. If we don't get to your question, please bear with us. What we'll do is we'll start to pull some together and see if we can put some responses from that perspective. Oh dear. Oh, gosh. Anna, just talk us through the bit around the traceability. What did we look at in terms of, you know, schemes and systems, and did we talk about AI and, you know, all of those other things that are out there?
Yeah, so at the end of the guidance, there's quite a comprehensive table which goes through some of the tech systems, tech solutions, accreditations, pre-qual systems, some of them that are out there in the marketplace, knowing that this is quite a saturated market. They all do different things, they all do similar things. So we've kind of categorized what it is that they can offer. This is all very much based on desk-based research. So we haven't spoke to people from those organizations, got any costings. Obviously, if you want to make a decision to use something, you will have to build a business case internally and do your own due diligence on the solution. But what we did find is, you know, there's lots of solutions out there. They can help gather information, but what is always at the heart of this, and we're currently going through a process at the moment, helping a client with supply chain mapping as well. And what is always at the heart of this is that relationship with the supplier. So whilst you can outsource gathering information to a third party who's got a fancy online system, in order to get quality data, it's having those relationships in place, which will really be key. So the table in the back of the report is a snapshot of some of the services that these providers offer. And obviously it depends on what your need is. You know, a lot of organizations out there already have some of these systems in place. They might just need an add-on for an audit part to it, or a risk mapping part to it, or a supply chain mapping part to it, whatever it might be. But yeah, it's just sort of a snapshot in time of what's currently out there in the marketplace.
Brilliant, thank you. AI, blockchain, I know there are some people on this webinar that provide solutions out there. It is a race at the moment over what traceability standards, what traceability you've got. The reality is that if we actually look at supply chain traceability, you're probably going to get as close to manufacturing. That will be relatively easy for you to get. Polysilicon, and in fact, actually the quartz that goes into the polysilicon will be the challenge. And I did a piece of work with a client where we were talking about blockchain, for example. It is a solution, but the challenge you have is if an organization has set itself up in a way to full blockchain, it will be fooled. It's about the movement of money, but they can set themselves up in a certain way that means money comes from one location that looks clean, but there'll be internal transfers that will hide things that are going on behind. And it is a real challenge at the moment, particularly with China, because they were actually at the very beginning of this very transparent over everything that they were providing. And then the world responded in the way it did around Xinjiang because of the atrocities that are happening there. And suddenly China started to stop being transparent because of the reaction that they had. So transparency is a really delicate subject, and is perceived very differently from a country to country perspective. Sometimes people are hiding things because they don't want people to see what they're doing because they're nervous about how they're going to respond. Sometimes traceability is not found because there's illegality happening. And a lot of the times it's just because our supply chains are structured in such a daft way that it's really just hard to find the information, particularly when we get into complex products like solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, anything that's got mechanical and electrical associated with it, which is where we'll see a lot of these issues. Katie put a question in about requirements to prove panels don't come from forced labour regions. This caused shifting to other countries, which we're seeing. So we're seeing growth in Vietnam, we're seeing growth in Malaysia. As we've mentioned, Germany, US, Canada, Australia, these are all the emerging countries. I think what we put in the report, though, is that they're off a very low baseline. So they're the biggest growths, but they're off a very, very, very low baseline. China's obviously one that everyone knows about. So what do you think the risk is around this, as companies think there may be less forced labour in their supply chain because they've moved out of China? No. The whole point behind the guide is we do focus a lot on China, and we've talked a lot because that's the issue that everybody's talking about, is the most complex, most difficult. But I think we repeated it, Anna and EJ, about 5 times in there, quite a significant number of times, of just because you're not in China doesn't mean that forced labour doesn't exist. But what you have got an opportunity to do is create that more continuous improvement approach to improving conditions in regions where they're much more open to, this isn't the right labour standard that we're looking for, can we actually improve on this? So Anna's point at the end around organisations that are already operating in these countries, that have the connections, that have the links, that understand the culture, they're the ones to get in touch with, to use them, to work with them, because the organisations they're working with are much more open to how do we deal with some of these issues, and dealing with the cultural differences that happen. China's just particularly difficult because of the whole link to state at this present moment in time. So I would say, even if you find Vietnam or Malaysia, which are indicated as high risk in general, although not high risk at the moment with solar panels, don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to get that information. They're much more likely to be transparent with you than maybe you are with some of the other areas. We're getting really close, so what I'm going to do is I'm speak to Billy at the end of this, where we haven't been able to answer your question, and where we've got something specific for Alexia around SSI. What we need to do is get those across, and we'll see if we can get those answered, and we'll look at some more, because we've had a huge tranche, and I can't believe that we're close to 2 hours being completed here. As you could tell, we could talk about solar panels for a long time, but I'm sure you want your lunch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go around the room and get one final piece of advice or guidance from everybody on the call for you. So Mandy, do you want to just give one final thought for everybody on the guide, on the project, on how they can apply it?
No, for me, it's just, I think it's something that I said earlier, but for me, it's just we have to go on this journey. There is no choice, but we can't, we need to try and minimise, obviously, the risk to people to hit the net zero target. And this is, for me, it's a great start to gain momentum.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mandy. Jo?
I think for me, it's that this guide, although focused on solar panels, is transferable. So there is things in there that you can transfer to other sort of renewable decarbonisation type things. So don't look at it in isolation for solar panels. Consider other things that you might be doing within your business.
Brilliant, thanks. Anna?
Mine's probably a little bit off-piste, actually, and it brings me back to something me, you, Helen and Ege, we talked about in a room in Birmingham ages ago. obviously there's a huge demand at the moment for solar panels, but I think the role of procurement as well is challenging the need for other things. So whilst solar is a great source of energy, on the whole, if we are to sort of combat, it might sound a bit woo-woo, but if we're to combat human issues, environmental issues, everything, it's challenging consumer demand right from the very beginning. So that understanding your need, you know, instead of buying loads and loads of solar panels to meet your energy demand, okay, let's take a step back. How can we start to reduce our energy in other different ways? So yeah, it's probably not related to the guidance, but just wanting to drop that in there, that consideration of what it is you're buying on a bigger scale, challenging consumer needs. Yeah.
No, that's brilliant. I love that comment, woo woo. I'm going to use that.
Sorry.
No, it's brilliant. I think it's really important, and we do talk in the understanding the need of challenging demand management, challenging the sort of thinking about what we want. And that's a bigger sustainability thing that everyone should be doing, regardless. So yeah, no, that's brilliant. Thanks, Anna. Alexia.
Yeah, so thank you so much, and I am very looking forward to continue working with you. As you know, as I probably have mentioned, the SSI is opening its governance to different stakeholders. So I'm hopeful that we can continue our collaboration also within the SSI project. And yes, very, very happy to answer questions even after this webinar.
Brilliant, thanks, Alexia. And EJ?
There's so many things we want to get across, but for me, the one piece of advice, it would be, this can feel just like the biggest challenge. How on earth can we do anything about this? So my advice would be kind of baby steps. If this is fairly new to you, don't think I have no leverage. There's absolutely nothing I can do. There will be small things you can do, and hopefully the bit in the guide that talks about leverage, that can help. As simple as just starting to raise awareness and start to have those conversations as well. That's a really good step in the right direction. So yeah, that's my advice.
No, that's brilliant. Thanks, EJ. One really interesting comment that came from somebody in the questions was around, this has been going on for a really long time in terms of human rights breaches, and actually linked to fossil fuel. It's linked to energy in general. It might feel like solar panels are being singled out. We've tried to write this guide in a way that says solar panels are just one of a large number of issues. And actually, if you look at our historical energy mix and you look at the human rights breaches that have been going on the petrochemical, been looking at the gas industry, human rights has been a problem for decades. I mean, I'm talking decades and decades and decades in the energy mix. Solar isn't being singled out from us mainly because, as far as we're concerned, it's one of a huge range of issues that are going on across the renewable sector. My personal opinion is that this is our perfect opportunity to right the wrongs and get it right. If we're putting a new mix in place and we know that we've breached so many human rights historically, it is really irresponsible of us to then put a whole new energy mix in place without really understanding how we do it in a fair and transparent way. So just transition is going to be a comment that you're going to hear more and more and more of. And it is really not just solars. We've got wind turbines, we've got a whole range of things to have a think about. So from our perspective, a massive thank you. Obviously, I've seen already through some of the comments, some of you've already been going through the guide, and I've got a couple of questions in terms of what's on page 26 or 25. So well done for those of you who have. Download it here. We are actually in face-to-face, so we're going to be presenting at Solar and Storage Live. I'm on a panel and Ege is doing a presentation on the guide, so come and see us in Birmingham. We're going to be at the Supply Chain Sustainability School Net Zero Summit in Coventry in a couple of weeks. I'm running a whole session on just transition, so we're going to hear from a huge range of organisations in there. And we have 2 speaker slots at the UK Construction Week, so we're going to be talking about modern slavery and traceability in its entirety, as well as obviously linking to things like solar panels, but other areas, bricks, labour on construction sites. We'll be there in person, so you get to see our lovely shiny faces if you want to come and talk to us. So please do. The other thing as well is some of you may or may not have been on a similar thing last week. So again, we have another report. We're quite busy at the moment writing reports, but a really good one on sustainable procurement. So please download that. As we've mentioned, our guide aligns with what's going on. We're trying to sort of harmonise the way you do this. So again, worth having a look at. And on the AS site, you'll see the webinar as well. I think that was last week. If you're not fed up with, well, actually I'm on it, but Anna's on it, and she's a brilliant endorsement from that as well. So do go and have a look. Other than that, our details will be around. If you want to have another chat with us, we've got a Calendly link on there. So if there's questions you really want to speak to us about in a one-to-one, our lovely Anna's only going to be here for a couple of more weeks, and then she's going off for the pitter-patter of little feet. So it'll be me and EJ who'll basically be able to speak to you. So please book some time in our diaries if you want to have a chat and explore some of these things in more detail, or email us if you've got any comments about the guide. We will be carrying on with this work. We're just trying to think about what's next. So if you've got some suggestions, please send them across to us. We're more than welcome. We more than welcome your input. It doesn't give you the whole answer, but it gives you a very big answer. So please enjoy the guide. Take it as a starter for 10. 2 minutes over, so sorry about that, but enjoy your lunch. And thank you so much to all the panelists today. It's been a great session. So thank you, everybody.